Okay, is everyone ready to start? I think so. Good stuff. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the report Mapping Rights and Duties at the Intersection of Sport, Human Rights and the Climate Crisis, delivered by the Cambridge Pro Bono Project and commissioned and with support from the Centre for Sport and Human Rights. My name is Matt Stone. I'm the Head of Communications for the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, and I'll be the facilitator today and will moderate the expert roundtable discussion, which will come later. So on the next slide, you'll see the agenda for today.
Wait a minute.
There we are. And on that agenda, you'll see in a moment, I'll be handing over to Leah Wyman from the University of Cambridge to give you an introduction to the university, to the Cambridge Pro Bono Project and the nature of the collaboration with the centre. Then we'll have Lucy Amis sitting to my right, who's Special Advisor from the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, who will set the scene about how the centre worked together with Cambridge on the project. Then we'll hear from the research team about the report and their perspectives. And then we'll have a short break if we need one. And then we'll move on to the roundtable expert discussion, which will look at themes the report raises for actors operating in sport, sustainability and human rights going forward. Then we'll have a Q&A session and then final wrapping up and reflections from the panel. So I'd like now to welcome Leah to give us an overview of Cambridge and the Pro Bono Project. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, welcome all of you here today, especially to all our guests coming to Cambridge for this, especially for this launch event, but also for those tuning in online. So it's a real pleasure that you're joining for this exciting discussion to map rights and duties at the intersection of sports, human rights and climate change. And to share the results of this report that's been the work of researchers here at Cambridge and research students for the last year in this collaborative academic project that reflects sort of the strength and the spirit of student-led legal research. And quickly here, there's also about the Cambridge Pro Bono Project. For now, we'll have a link, but we'll also update it to the center where you can download the report and the executive summary. But if you want to have a quick glance of it right now, especially for the exec summary as we're speaking, there is a QR code that should lead you there as well. I think overall, we find ourselves at quite a historic time for climate law specifically. As you may know, tomorrow, the world's highest court, the International Court of Justice, will release its first ever legal opinion on the climate crisis. And this has the potential to clarify state obligations with regards to climate change and human rights, and is therefore also relevant to our discussion about the intersection of human rights, climate change and sport. But before we get into the topic, I want to quickly introduce a little bit more about what the Cambridge Pro Bono Project is. So the CPP is a flagship initiative housed within the Faculty of Law at the University of Cambridge, and it was established in the Faculty of Law in 2010 by Professor Philippe Sands. And every year it undertakes around 5 to 6 major projects and hosts a number of events focused on public, criminal and international law, and it harnesses the academic talents and critical thinking of postgraduate students specifically to produce independent research on legal issues of pressing public concern. And the report that we're talking about here today is actually one of 5 projects that were happening at the CPP in the 2024 to 2025 academic year. And it has been authored and compiled by a team of postgraduate researchers who have generously volunteered their time, knowledge, and energy to explore this complex and emerging intersection of sports, human rights, and climate change. As you will discover throughout today's discussion, there's no explicit international framework that governs this interplay between sport, human rights, and climate change. However, there are relevant state obligations in the field that can be derived from existing international instruments and frameworks, which this research has focused on. And the work is entirely student-led, academically grounded, and guided by a commitment to social justice and public interest law. So we'll also hear a little bit more insight today from the researchers themselves, which is really exciting. So what especially makes the CPP distinctive is not just the research and the quality of research, but also its collaborative ethos. So we've been really fortunate to be collaborating with the Center of Sports and Human Rights this year, and had a really strong collaboration throughout the year. To sort of discuss this topic and talk about the emerging themes and research that's emerging of it. Of course, the CPP maintains academic independence while actively engaging with its external partners, and it has sort of been a very mutually enriching collaboration to hear also the real-world sort of insights from the CHAR on sort of the broader framework and application of the research. So it's given us some thought onto how this can be best applicable and actually a useful report that will then also have value afterwards. So yeah, I think it's overall the report is quite intense and long if you have a look at it, but it also should be understood as sort of a really broad academic exploration contribution to this ongoing discussion in the area. But hopefully it will serve as a valuable resource to offer sort of legal perspectives and analytical clarity into the issues that urgently demand our sustained attention from legal to sporting and environmental communities alike. And yeah, I really look forward to the discussions today and revealing some of the findings. There's a really big report, so I think we'll only scratch the surface of what can be found within there. Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to start this conversation here, and hopefully we'll continue onwards. Like I said at the beginning, for a quick peek, you can scan the QR code if you, throughout the discussion, want to have already a look. It will also go onto the Centre's website soon. And yeah, once again, thank you so much for being here. I look forward to the conversations that this report inspires both here today, but also going forward in the future. And with that, I hand over to Lucy to give a little bit of an introduction to the collaboration from the Centre's perspective.
Hello so much. Hello. Hi, everyone. So I'm Lucy Amos, and it's been a real privilege to work with the team. Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Tonya, and all the students that we've been working with. My job a little bit is to set the scene for the conversation today, sort of why we're here. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Centre, because probably quite a few of you don't know very much about us, the way we work, why we started to identify this particular challenge around climate change in connection with sport and human rights as something to really focus on, and a little bit of the background to how the project got started from our side, if you like. But obviously it's really collaborative, and it's we're delighted with the outcome. So thank you. So in the next slide, just a little bit about the Centre. So we are a human rights organisation for the world of sport. We are a civil society organisation with our governance structure based in both the UK and also in Switzerland. We're a registered charity in the UK. And our mission is to really be to advance the respect and protection of human rights in sport. And that is, we do that by building the capacity of actors within sport and in the world of sport, generating greater awareness, and also, we hope, delivering impact. And that's what we strive to do at all times. All of our work is very grounded in international human rights norms, particularly the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were agreed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011, and are the basis for a lot of really emerging good practice within the whole world of sport today when it comes to human rights. They're the basis of policies, due diligence processes. So that's really our grounding. And in the next slide, I just explain perhaps a little bit more about kind of how we work. So human rights, when we're talking about human rights in sport, and there are a lot of people, obviously probably not many of you here, but particularly those that we interact with within sports, within the world of sports, sports bodies, event organisers, are not human rights experts. They are sport people, they are delivering sports events, they are covering sports events, they are sponsoring and offering finance to sports events, and they're providing the logistics and supply chains for those sports events. But they are not human rights experts, and we try to bring these two worlds together a little bit. When we talk about human rights in sport, we're talking about anything that is affecting the dignity and well-being of the people in sport. So that's the athletes, the fans, the workers, the local communities, and the journalists, among others. And in that space, we're talking about everything from our communities around mega sporting events benefiting from those events, or are they being impacted negatively through, for example, displacement? Are workers, are their rights being respected in the workplace? Many of you will be familiar with issues around construction workers in Qatar, but it's not limited to Qatar. There are issues also in the supply chain for sporting goods, both event and non-event related. There are issues around the rights of fans, whether they're being protected, the way that crowd control is being managed is safe and fair to those people, but also do they have an opportunity to engage in peaceful protest within the kind of remit of the event? Athletes in particular, do they also enjoy decent working conditions? Are they enjoying the protections that all people, all workers are entitled to? So that's everything from the right to non-discrimination, addressing pay inequality, and issues around harassment, abuse, and violence. And then I think, have I forgotten anyone? Probably. And then there's also a role here for broadcasters. So there's issues around press freedom, the right of journalists covering these events, but also how the decisions made when broadcasting these events, particularly in challenging human rights contexts, and more that is a global phenomenon. It was very easy some years ago to say, oh, these countries good, those countries bad. We know those lines are no longer very blurred, and that's the reality of the world in which we now live. And so, in addition to the fact that our focus is on these actors in the middle, and we're looking to try and ensure the rights of all these people are respected, there is a role here. So these are the rights holders. Very often in sports people understand the term rights holders as the people who have the rights to commercial ventures, whether that's broadcast rights. In the human rights terms, we're talking about the people. So for today's purposes, we're going to be talking about rights holders as these people in the middle. But then there is a responsibility of all of the institutional actors, the duty bearers in human rights language, to be respecting and protecting the rights of these people, and at a very minimum, avoiding any harm to them. And this is kind of how we interact and work as an organisation. We recognise that none of these challenges that I've spoken about so far today, are things that any one actor in this whole ecosystem can solve alone. It requires them coming together in collective action. It requires exchange. It requires engagement with these people to hear their opinions, their voices, and their solutions. So in the next slide, I'm going to this is just a little bit about the network that we interact with. It's a growing and wider network. And as you can see, there's everything from UN agencies to governments to sponsors, broadcasters, civil society organisations, trade unions, and others. You can look at it later on our website. No need to bore you with the details on that one. But in the next slide, really just one of the roles that we play, we convene events, we offer advice to sports bodies. One of the things that we do is, as an expert organisation, we try to identify emerging trends and challenges for sports actors, and we try to do so in a way that is not only identifying a challenge, but also trying to explore, okay, how can we find solutions to those challenges? And so we do that through developing tools, and new literature. There's a fans guide, there's a meaningful engagement tool, there's work particularly around what we call the roadmap to remedy, which is trying to find ways to have trauma-informed remedy processes, particularly for victims of abuse in sport. And this is kind of the way we work, but it is very much identifying some of the challenges that can be encountered, what's on the horizon, and being prepared and ready to address those. One of these, as you'll see in the next slide, is climate change. And that is something that is it's inescapable for everyone. We know that sport is now increasingly at a crossroads, and this is having knock-on effects not only for the athletes and all of the people that I mentioned earlier, but it's also having impacts on broadcast coverage and schedules. It's also having impacts on sponsorship activations, because those activations rely on a predictable calendar of events, and that calendar is now being radically disrupted by the climate crisis. But it's much more than what that means for sport and how sport functions. It's also about the people. And for example, we have, you will no doubt be familiar with the issues around workers operating in high temperatures in Qatar. As I said, that's not unique to Qatar. In Texas, there was some legislation that they were trying to revoke some of the protections for laborers in construction sites in Texas ahead of the FIFA World Cup next year. So it's by no means unique to Qatar. There are issues also, obviously, around the athletes themselves. I think it will have escaped anybody who's watching tennis last week that at Wimbledon, the temperatures are up in the mid 30s, and there are issues around how do we actually protect those tennis players from those incredibly draining heats, which in the Australian Open has required really lengthy breaks for the tennis players. There are issues around wildfires. So in Canada, in 2023, there were major wildfires. It meant that grassroots sport was completely cut down and curtailed and suspended because it wasn't safe even for recreational sport, and particularly at the elite level, competitions and events and matches were deferred. Even with one, I think it's the Pittsburgh Pirates that play quite close to the Canadian border, there was a whole debate about whether they should go ahead and proceed with the match that they were playing or not. So these are some of the issues that are encountering. We talked obviously about the workers in the next slide, but though it's not just isolated to heat. Obviously, there are issues around flooding. Venice is not immune to flooding, but coastal erosion means that at the Venice Marathon in 2023, the routes were having to be diverted, and actually the athletes' safety was in peril. Also, coastal erosion is affecting the navigation ability of sailing and other ocean sports. And then finally, in the next slide, you'll see that obviously the winter sport, as we're all very acutely aware, is now seriously in jeopardy. The predictions are that by 2050, I think it's something like 21 of the previous Olympic host cities will no longer be viable as Olympic venues. What is less analysed is what that means for the skiers and the bobsleighers and the luges and all of the other people, because the ice conditions and the ski conditions are now much more dangerous for those athletes. But it also means major disruption to local communities and industries in those contexts. So in the next one, just really wanted to make it clear that this is not some sort of all doom and gloom. There is positive action taking place. There are a lot of initiatives, programs. There's the UN Sport for Climate Action Framework that's taking a positive role. At the Paris Olympics last year, and also the UEFA Euros in Germany, there were some really meaningful steps to try and address some of these problems. But the problem is that we're seeing an extent to which there is a focus, if you like, on meeting quantifiable targets. And I think there's a risk that we're in meeting those targets, which are imperative and do need to be met, we're actually losing sight of why we're doing that in the first place. And that is really recognizing that the climate crisis is also fundamentally a human rights crisis. And that means human rights of people now, not just in some distant future that we're not seeing. So climate, so if you can turn to the next slide. One of the areas that we pursue is in the area of knowledge, education and research. My colleague Shubham Jain, who unfortunately couldn't be here today for personal reasons, has been working very, very closely with me and the great team at the Cambridge Pro Bono Project. And as part of our work in identifying emerging challenges, we've done some scoping on this issue. So last year we started to scope some of the issues, what action was being taken. We did outreach with some leading lights in this field. So Madeleine Orr and the Sport Ecology Network. Madeleine Orr is at the University of Toronto, and I believe that David worked to some extent on a book that she produced last year. We interacted with her. We've worked with the Sport Positive Summit, and we were delighted to collaborate with Sky and the TV Industry Human Rights Forum at that event last October, I think it was. And we've also published this blog. So we did this blog last year, which is Joining the Dots. And one of the challenges that we're seeing is that whilst there are human rights efforts in sport and there are climate efforts in sport, the alignment between the two is currently lacking. And it's really imperative that we start to connect those dots. So what does that mean in the next slide? Is really that we need an evidence base. If we at the centre are going to fulfil our mission to try and help build the capacity and deliver impact, we have to do that on a strong evidence base. And that means that we have to make sure that we're working in a way that is robust, but it gives us the tools with which to make persuasive arguments and come up with collective solutions to some of these problems. So we were delighted that we were able to collaborate with the Cambridge team, that came to fruition. We're immensely grateful to all of the students, and I know that we have, well, Leah was overseeing it, but Tonya and her partner in crime, Sriram, were kind of leading the team of researchers. And I know, I hope I haven't forgotten anybody, we have Cecile, Bridget, Theo and Raka as well here today to talk about their work on the project. But really just the final thing to say at this point before I pass over is that one of the things that we want to try and encourage is that there are kind of three broad areas where we think a human rights lens is helpful. One is in identifying what does the climate crisis's impact on sport, how is that affecting people? And that's all of the actors I've identified so far. How does sport's contribution to the crisis directly affect people, but also its mitigations? There are risks that without properly considering the human rights risks, that even some of the solutions that sport's coming up with could also inadvertently damage people's rights. So those are some of the considerations we need to think about. And then sport has a huge persuasive, inspirational role to play, and it can be a really positive force in addressing the climate crisis. But if we take a human rights lens to this, there is an opportunity to hear the voices of people and encourage participation and empowerment of those people to be part of the solution. So that's just to give you a little bit of a flavour. That was sort of some of the parameters that we kind of shared with our colleagues at the Cambridge Pro Bono team. And without any further ado, I will now pass to the team to explain what they got up to. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. So my name is Tonya Shokmal. I'm the co-project manager for this report alongside Sriram Prasad, who unfortunately could not join us today for personal reasons. So I will talk about the report in general first, and then the researchers will join me afterwards for their specific areas of research. So the report was structured around the following questions. Which are the human rights that are impacted and how, due to the impacts of the climate crisis? Who are the impacted right holders? And what are the duties of the institutional actors and the responsibility of the various stakeholders in the sports ecosystem? So the first part of the report maps a range of human rights impacted by the climate crisis in the sports ecosystem. And then the second part analyzes the corresponding responsibilities of duty bearers in relation to climate action in, around, and through sports. More specifically, the first part examines how the climate's impact on sport affects certain rights within the international human rights framework. It also explores how rights can be affected by sport's own impacts on the climate. And we focused on 9 specific different rights. So the rights to life, to health, to decent work, to cultural life, to education, development, access information, rest, leisure and play, and the right to adequate standard of living. So the researchers explored the sources for these different rights in international and regional law, and then examined how the intersection of climate change, sport impacts each right and affects specific stakeholders in the sports ecosystem in the context of community events, but also mega sporting events like the Olympic or Paralympic Games and various World Cups. The second part then explores where the duties and responsibilities lie to address these impacts. It analyzes two types of duty barriers. So we have the state actors, such as the governments and other public authorities, and the non-state actors. So, for example, privately run event organizers, sport clubs, federations, or sport sponsors. Broadly, we found that duties do exist, given the current legal obligations under human rights law, and also given the recent developments in cases concerning climate change. And we explored how these duties may extend to the sports ecosystem. Then the report also explores how non-state actors possess certain responsibilities under domestic and international frameworks, such as the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, or the EU Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence, and also the UK anti-slavery law. Our methodology was generally an in-depth literature review of the legal frameworks applicable to human rights, sport, and climate change. And we combined this with empirical examples, as it was important for us to combine the theoretical research with real-life situations. Among our key findings, yes, first, well, as in general human rights law, the fact that human rights are strongly interconnected, especially also in the sports ecosystem. So sometimes when we have a violation of the right to health, it often also or can entail a violation of the right to life, for example. And second, vulnerable and marginalized people and communities suffer even more from adverse climate effects on sport. So, for example, migrant workers, women, elderly people, or people with disabilities. And we concluded that collectively, state and non-state actors have an obligation to protect human rights and prevent harm in relation to climate change in sports. So duties and responsibilities can emerge from existing frameworks, and we wouldn't recommend a new specific framework just for the sports ecosystem. And now I hand over to our researchers who did the research. So I'm happy to invite Cecile Schuster, Bridget Horneman-Wen, Pio Andichova, and Raka Kamil to the stage and go into more the details.
So I'm Cecile, and I was responsible for researching the right to life, the right to decent work, and the right to an adequate standard of living. I think one of the biggest challenges for me as a researcher on this project was sort of unpacking how climate change simultaneously impacts multiple human rights at once and how that kind of like interlinks. And also the clear gap in scholarship addressing the tripartite intersection of climate change, sport, and human rights, which required us to kind of rely on grey literature or cross-disciplinary sources a lot. Much evidence comes from news reports and non-academic sources, so it was quite challenging at times to establish clear legal links, especially around vague standards like those, for example, in the right to an adequate standard of living. Yes, so about the right to life, it includes the protection from foreseeable and preventable death. And we identified that the worst risk to the right to life in sports is extreme heat, as it threatens athletes, workers, but also community sports where, for example, you see children collapsing in youth tournaments due to inadequate protections. Then we, of course, have air pollution. So, for instance, also wildfire smoke that causes deadly respiratory diseases, and global warming, and this was quite surprising to me, also increases the spread of mosquito and tick-borne illnesses. And this risk is growing even in non-tropical regions, as was shown by the Paris 2024 Olympics. We then, of course, have melting snow, floods, wildfires, and erosion that make natural sports environments unsafe. And risks include avalanches, drowning, and heat illness. We also identified disproportionate impacts on low-income groups, communities of color, children, and older adults. And risk factors include poor access to healthcare, fewer green spaces, and a sport culture where it is encouraged to stay quiet and not sort of like talk about your issues. So children are often brought up not to complain about issues they're facing. Yeah, that was about the right to life.
So I'm Bridget and I did the rights to health and to development, and I won't talk as specifically about some of the reasons why health is impacted because it was so closely related to the right to life, and so that's why they follow each other in the report. But under international law, the right to health includes the right to physical and mental well-being. And so essentially it's the highest attainable standard of that level of health. And so climate change has direct and cascading impacts on that right. So you have direct impacts. Some of those ones that spring to mind quite easily. So we're very familiar with the fact that, heat stress will raise cardiovascular problems, higher air temperatures affects your quality of sleep and your quality of health that way. But others are less obvious, and they highlight the vicious cycle that climate change has. So, for example, where climate change will negatively impact on a community's economy and its ability to have a functioning health system, then that community is less able to secure the right to health. And through sport industry itself, there can be a lot of negative feedback loops created, and this is sort of what Lucy was touching on earlier as well. So, for example, we have artificial snow to address the shorter snow seasons and the icy conditions that are on the slopes now. But artificial snow generation itself emits has quite a high level of emissions. So then it contributes to the problem that it's trying to address. And then, of course, there's the fact that it's not only athletes who are affected. So, once again, the situation of workers at the Qatar World Cup is a very famous and obvious example. But that's sort of replicated throughout the sporting industry. And as with the right to life, and as we'll see with the rest of the life throughout the report, it is considered continuously the marginalised groups who are most affected.
So the International Labour Organization defines decent work as productive employment that ensures fair income, workplace safety, social protections, and dignity. And climate change, as we have found, disrupts these guarantees across the sports sector, threatening livelihoods and labour rights. Of course, winter sports face existential threats with entire ski areas closing due to warming and causing job losses and instability. Event staff and construction workers, as we've already heard today, often endure extreme heat and air pollution without adequate hydration, cooling breaks, or personal protective equipment, violating International Labour Organization safety standards. Athletes, especially in endurance sports, face growing risks of heat stress and respiratory illness, worsened by the frequent exclusion from formal employment status, which limits access to healthcare and injury compensation. And we can't forget children in sport who are vulnerable to heat exhaustion as well, of course, but often safeguards are missing for pre-professional events. Climate-driven event cancellations reduce sponsorship and prize money, often threatening athletes' financial security. And migrant workers in sectors like construction and hospitality face unsafe conditions and wage theft, made worse by their often precarious legal status and employer dependency.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the right to education. And the way we approached this right in the report was to see physical activities as an inseparable part of the right to education. And this is also reflected in the legal frameworks. And therefore, climate change challenges that limit the right to education also infringe on the access to physical education and sport. However, this does not mean that these challenges are identical. children and young people can lose access to sports specifically, for example, as a result of displacement due to extreme weather conditions or because of the lack of appropriate facilities or when education is delivered online, as we have seen in recent years, becoming a growing trend. And this growing impact that the climate change has on access to education, including more limited access to sporting facilities, is felt not only in regions with long-standing challenging climate conditions and limited resources. And it is important to stress that these regions continue to experience the worst challenges of all, but it is also increasingly felt in regions like Europe and North America, as demonstrated, for example, by the recent floods in Texas or in Central Europe in last summer. It has been shown that access to physical activities while growing up positively impacts one's health and their ability to learn, as well as it provides necessary skills for survival in extreme weather conditions, for example, swimming. We should be therefore mindful to the impact climate change has on the access to education. And any efforts to mitigate these challenges should also bear in mind adequate access to sport as well. And this is especially true, this should be especially inclusive to those who might need special adjustments as well as a result of disability, or to those who face additional challenges as a result of gender discrimination and other forms of oppression, as my colleagues have already mentioned. One of my key takeaways from research on rights to education is that there is a link between the worsening impact of climate change on resource scarcity and political stability in the most affected regions. It has been shown that climate change can act as a conflict multiplier, and it exacerbates existing stresses and creates new ones. As I mentioned previously, climate change increasingly impacts all areas of the world, and with that come new challenges. And I believe that the next biggest one, other than reversing the damage that we have already caused to the climate, will be whether we can work together and support one another, or whether we will let these difficult times turn us against each other. And that's where I think sport can be of huge help, as it can facilitate the dialogue and build bridges where traditional means of communication no longer suffice.
So following on from that, the right to development is sort of a much lesser known right. It's not binding, but essentially means under international law the right to improvement of a population's well-being to a certain adequate living standard. And following on from what Theo was saying, sport has traditionally and quite commonly been understood, including by the UN, as being a very cost-effective and flexible tool to promote peace and development objectives, including in relation to health. So climate change puts the effectiveness of that at risk, because developing countries often don't have the economic capacity to heavily invest in sports within their budgets. And so they're therefore unable to invest in some of the adaptive measures, such as air-conditioned venues, that the developed counterparts might be able to. So things like that and other weather-related factors, as well as what I was touching on before, climate change damaging economies, means that sport may not be able to keep being used as a mechanism for development. And a key finding as well in the research was that we have these development mechanisms, but they're overwhelmingly used in urban centres anyway, and not at the grassroots level, where arguably they're probably most needed. So there's similarly to that, if fundamental conditions for development are not met, such as clean drinking water, stable housing, education and healthcare, then individuals and communities may lack the basic capacity required to prioritise or engage in sport and its associated benefits. So in that way, the right to development really highlights the disproportionate effects of the climate crisis on sport and how they're related to each other. Once again, rights holders who are most vulnerable to climate change impacts on their development are often those for whom opportunities to access sport are very limited. And any measures to address the intersections between the right to development, sport and climate change need to really be alive to those systemic inequalities that exist. Importantly, that means that this means recognising that sport for development is not just relevant to low and middle income countries and regions of conflict, but also to impoverished areas of major cities and developed countries, and also to Indigenous communities.
So the second right I had the chance to research was the right to access information. Some of the challenges to this right include greenwashing, inaccurate or misleading data about the impact of sporting activities or events on the environment, or accessing accurate and inclusive information about the impact of climate change on health of the various actors in the sport industry. Different regions offer different levels of protection of this right, and there may not always be a legal duty to provide the necessary information or repercussions imposed for providing false information. In the context of sports, this can be reflected, for example, in the choice of location of massive sport events. And the more protection a country offers to the people's right to access information, the more accountable those involved in the organization of these events will be, and the more informed choices those who wish to attend these events will have. My key takeaway from researching this right was that not everyone has an equal chance to contribute to the research on the impacts of climate change. It has been found that out of 100 highly cited papers on climate change, less than 1% of the authors were based in Africa, while almost 75% had affiliation with institutions in Europe and Northern America. Less than 25% of authors were women, and only 12% of papers had women as their lead authors. This lack of representation is not unique to research on climate change, but in this context, and when applied to sports specifically, and especially when it comes to research on the health of women athletes in extreme heat or the rights of those in the most affected regions, it can be detrimental to these people's lives for their interests if their voices are not adequately represented.
Yeah, so sorry. The right to an adequate standard of living is a quite broad and low-level right, and encompasses many of the things we've talked about already. It ensures access to housing, food, water, sanitation, and overall physical, mental, and social well-being. And climate change again disrupts this by undermining the ability to participate in sports, which support health, social cohesion, and cultural life. And children face disproportionate harm. Extreme weather reduces access to recreational sport, harming development and increasing inactivity from an early age on. Community sports infrastructure, so for example, pitches or ice rinks, is increasingly damaged by flooding, thawing, and heat, limiting access, importantly also for marginalized groups. Mega sporting events can worsen access. So families may be forced to be relocated without proper housing, as for example was the case in the Rio 2016 Olympics, or for example in Sochi 2014, resources like water were diverted from residents for venue construction. And all this shows us that there's a need for climate sensitive and rights respecting planning in sports infrastructure and events.
So the report we divided in two sections. On the latter section, we discussed about duties. Previously, we discussed about rights, so it's more in the perspective of us as a human, what rights do we have? And then duties, we would perceive it as the other stakeholder, which is what obligation do they have to ensure that our rights is upheld. And in this report, we divided into between state and non-state actors. We have a few other team members who discuss about non-state actors when my research primarily focuses on state actors. So in this presentation today, I am mostly going to discuss what I research on which is through the state actors. From our findings, we see that there are various frameworks, and especially in international and regional agreements regulating state duties for human rights, state duties for climate change, and some also a bit of a relationship between sports and climate change. However, as Leah Purvis mentioned, and Tony also mentioned, that there are no regulatory frameworks regulating directly between the interplay between human rights, climate change, and sport. But we can some sort of And if we see it on a broader context, we can see some inferences that we can draw upon it and see how it's related to that interplay between the three. Firstly, I can discuss mostly about the frameworks. In the report, we discuss various international agreements and regional agreements regulating these state duties. At international level, there are a few that we mentioned in the report, such as the International Bill of Rights, Aarhus Convention, Paris Agreement, and UNGP. And in terms of regional agreements, we see there's the European Convention on Human Rights, EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, American Convention on Human Rights, African Charter on Human Rights and People's Rights, Asian Human Rights Declaration, and Arab Charter of Human Rights. I won't go into details, that's quite lengthy, it's already discussed in the report. But maybe I would like to zoom in that I find particularly interesting when I research about this. First, on terms of international level, I'd like to highlight on the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, UNGP. This is not per se a binding international regulation. It's more of a guideline for the state and also for companies. So even that from there, you can see the target is not only state, but also the companies. But again, since it's international framework, the primary target is still the state. So it is the duty of state actors to translate all of these human rights obligations into their domestic framework. And then again, if we see that this is just discussing about human rights. So we're there. Interestingly, in 2023, in June 2023, the working group then introduced an information note, and this information note further elaborates how UNGP would integrate the impacts of climate change and how it relates to human rights. And this is particularly important for major sporting events. As previously mentioned by our team, major sporting events affect a lot of things socially and environmentally. Socially, in a sense of people, homes being demolished, they have to move out, and environmentally, it affects more on the greenhouse gas emissions, water supply. So it affects a lot of things. So it's very important for state to ensure all of this are upheld. And in terms of the regional level, one thing that I find particularly interesting in Europe region, they have European Sports Charter, which emphasizes the principle of sustainability in sport activities, which includes being economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. This charter also recognizes the access to sport as a fundamental right and should be guaranteed in a safe environment. So as we can see, this though not directly stated, you can see all the interplay kind of forming there, but it's not directly mentioned. It is though quite unfortunate that this type of framework only exists in Europe and other regions do not have the similar framework. Moving on the second part, I also discuss about case law. So not only obligation arises from frameworks, but we can see that it could be inferred from case laws on how court said that what are the duties arising from it. Again, there's no specific climate case law or human rights case law that specifically mention about this interplay of the three. But from the report, we can see that there are a few that we can try to reasonably try to draw inferences. And the report we tried to go different parts of the world, and it's very interesting to see the different facts and different social, economic, and geographical factor plays into part of this climate case. It would also, not only that, we have also mentioned about advisory opinions. So it's not through litigation, but more about clarify what court says. These are the duties of the state. So it's very interesting, as Leah mentioned, tomorrow going to be the ICJ advisory opinion, and we're looking forward to see what would be like what ICJ would say. What are the duties of the state? Now, for the case that we believe there will be like 3 points that we can take. Firstly, despite the complexity of the climate change, states can be held accountable for human rights violations. This can be seen through the Urgenda case, where also this Netherlands failed to for the greenhouse gas emissions. And also we can see that by the advisory opinion of Inter-American Court, state obligations can arise from the human rights. So the perspective is that there is a human rights and then state obligation arises from it. So it's not the obligation there, like kind of reverse if you see it. And then secondly, also marginalized communities are recognized as vulnerable human rights violation induced by climate change, as since the Klima Seniorinnen case. And also it's interesting that despite a lot of cases, there is focus mostly on the global north. There are also cases arising in the global south, and this is particularly seen in the Ligari case, where it's a farmer by himself, representing himself in court. So it's quite interesting to see that the litigation is not only happening in global north, but global south. People are recognizing climate change is also an issue. And lastly, there's also increasingly issues, cases about private corporations being held liable for their contribution to greenhouse gas emission. And maybe lastly, as a closing remark for the duties, it is important to note that although there are various frameworks that already existed and also case law that we can infer from it, there is still no particular regulatory framework that regulates the interplay between the three. And this current legal gap highlights the need for clear regulatory framework and the guidance of state in order to protect and maintain the interplay between the three. And explicit regulatory framework, or perhaps a clear opinion from advisory opinion from CJ and also other quotes, could help clarify the state's obligation to ensure that there is more clear legal standing. Should there are parties that are affected, they have clear legal standing, and if they want to seek remedies.
That's perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much there from the research team taking us through the report from their point of view. We can have a very short break if anyone would like a comfort break. Yeah, it looks like we've got one or two nodding. Okay, so if we say we meet back in here in 5 minutes, would that be okay with everyone? Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks everyone. I think we've all had a little comfort break. It looks like everyone's back in the room. Some of us have started on the cheese straws, I think. That's good. Hopefully there's some left. Oh, no. Okay, that's no problem. Okay, so we've been joined by a couple of experts as well for the roundtable expert discussion, and this is to look deeper into the issues and what next steps might be required. It's my pleasure to welcome our 5 panelists. Next to me, we have Lucy Amis, Senior Advisor at the Centre for Sport and Human Rights. Then we've got Mike Dignan, who is a professor at the University of Paris. And I thought the Centre for Sport and Human Rights was a pretty good centre, pretty good name. But he is, get this, the founder and chair for the Centre for Events and Festivals.
I'm trying to rival you.
That's
what I'm trying to do.
Festivals, I think, is a pretty good one, I have to say. He's also the editor-in-chief of Event Management Journal. Then we have David Lockwood, who's a sustainable sport journalist and analyst. And then we've met Leah and Tonya already from the University of Cambridge. So I think we'll jump in, and primarily for Leah and Tonya this one. Could you give us a bit of an understanding of the legal landscape we face around this issue, where we're trying to bring together these 3 issues, where sometimes the 2 of them are together. Often we have climate change and sport, we have climate change and human rights and sport, but to try and bring those 3 things together perhaps is quite new and emerging.
Yes. So yeah, as I already mentioned in my welcome remarks, I think we find ourselves at quite an important time if we look at the intersectional sort of human rights and climate change. 24 hours ahead of the advisory opinion by the ICJ. So I hope you all follow that tomorrow to look at what are the obligations of states in the climate crisis with regards to human rights. But of course, also, I think it's really important to mention the advisory opinion that recently came out by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights that obviously looks less at an international level, more specific to the Inter-American context, but it's considered one of the most progressive documents released by an international court on the climate crisis and human rights. And we were able to sneak some of the findings, because I mean, it was just a couple of weeks ago, into the report at the end. So that's good. And yeah, I think one of the ones that I just want to highlight here is it recognizes states' duties to prevent irreversible harm to the climate system as jus cogens, which means that it's a preemptory norm under international law. So at the highest level, cannot be disregarded under any circumstances. And that was quite, I think put quite a shockwave of like excitement through the international legal community, but also really shows us how much we are dealing in the climate emergency currently already, how rights are being affected, and what we can do to sort of stop that irreversible harm and try and address the issues at stake. So really we're facing quite an intersecting crisis. We have climate change, we have biodiversity loss, we have social injustices, and yeah, I think it's no surprise that we are seeing sort of the international courts and legal system stepping up to address these challenges. But of course, we also within this framework have silos, and especially if we start looking at how does it intersect with other sectors, which let's say here we're looking at the example of the sports sector. How can we look already at a sector that we're really having the intersection of human rights and climate change? There's already a lot of discussion. What are the duties and obligations there? Then we're bringing in another aspect of how does this relate to sports? So I think this is really interesting. But of course, we have a really good evidence already that is based through research of how sports ecosystem interacts with human rights, and through that there can be a lot of inferences, as the research has explained already that are presented in the report on how we can draw these links. And I think it's really interesting. I think litigation should be seen as a last resort, and we don't have this big case example of sports ecosystem, human rights, and climate change, and that three-way interaction. But actually, we don't really want it to come to that level. We want to create, I think one of the things that should happen through the legal changes, look, what are the obligations and duties, not necessarily to bring them to court. Of course, when there's instances where it needs to happen because of human rights abuses, of course, but I think it's interesting to look at how can we create some of this change through looking at the opportunities that are present. And yeah, I think there's a lot that can be said there as well in terms of looking at how can it be a sports ecosystem, how can it act as a cultural catalyst, how can we use sort of the platform of athletes, but also everyday citizens, so just engaging in sport, to speak about this, to raise awareness, to educate. And I think we often forget how powerful like stories and narratives are in creating change rather than just facts and figures. So I think ingraining sustainability more at events and raising sort of public awareness on what can be done, but also what has to be done right from the start when these things are planned and organized, that we make sure that it's really at the heart of everything that is done, because climate change is affecting everyone, is affecting all industries. But rather than seeing as this big scary monster that's just going to destroy everything, we should also see this as an opportunity to address some of the human rights abuses that are already happening, and how can we improve the social injustices that are happening. So yeah, that's enough for me on this. I don't know, Tony, if you have any other comments to add, but there's certainly a lot of challenges that we see ahead, but with that also comes the opportunity to address them head on while we still can.
Yeah, so to add on what Leah was just saying, there is no universally binding legal framework that connects the three factors. And in addition, it's also particularly challenging that most sports governing bodies are transnational in nature. So sometimes legally it's very difficult to know which state has jurisdiction over their actions. Is it the state of domiciliation of the concerned federation, for example, or is it the state where the actions are carried out? So many things are not clear yet, but there is also reason for hope. For example, despite the fact that many frameworks are not binding, not legally binding, like, for example, the UN guiding principles, many sports governing bodies do refer to them, at least in their internal standards, and this at least a little bit raises awareness about these issues. So, for example, in the 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup's risk assessment, there was a reference to it, or the Paris 24 Olympics human rights strategy mentioned it. And of course, we could say this is just a drop in the ocean, but it is better a little. I would say it's better. We have a little step in the right direction than none at all. And also for the OECD guidelines, for example, these are accompanied by a non-judicial grievance mechanism at the national level. So that means that, for example, national authorities can know cases where human rights violations might occur. So, for example, the national contact point of Switzerland dealt with a case alleging that FIFA did not observe these OECD guidelines by appointing Qatar as the host state for the 22 FIFA Men's World Cup. And this led in practice to mediation sessions between the building and woodworkers union and FIFA, focused on decent and safe working conditions for the stadium construction workers. And very concretely, this led to increased monitoring of the situation and also coincided with the creation of a Human Rights Advisory Board by FIFA. So an institutional dialogue between FIFA and stakeholders. So that's what I wanted to add there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Tonia. So steps are being taken. And I'd like to say that we will have a Q&A session at the end of this discussion, but if anyone has any specific questions on the legal framework or any of the questions as we go along, please just raise your hand and we can take them as we go. So we've seen that some steps are being taken legally. I'd like to turn to Lucy now. What are the principal challenges and opportunities linked to sport and the climate crisis? And we've talked about the legal side, but where are the people at the heart of this conversation?
Thanks, Matt. So I think two things. One is with this report, we now are one of the challenges that we had was there wasn't enough understanding and awareness of the issues. And that's still a long journey. But I think with this report, we start to have a better understanding of how people are affected and which people are being affected. So I think that gives us a building block to build off. As others have talked about, whilst there are different issues around the duties and obligations of the government actors and the non-governmental actors, where the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights comes in, and also the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, is this emphasis on due diligence by both the state actors, the government actors, but also by the sports bodies and the businesses that interact with those sports. We see, and we've done a whole separate piece of work which we can share with you called the State of Play Emerging Practice in Sport and Human Rights. And that's starting to demonstrate where there is really, some of it's more robust than others. Some of it's kind of baby steps and other things are actually quite advanced. And as you mentioned, the New Zealand, Australia Women's World Cup 2 years ago was one of the more robust ones, but there is still a lot of work to do. That being said, so there is a foundation now on which to build. Sports bodies are starting to translate some of the stuff into practice, as are their sponsors and broadcast partners. We're also seeing more standards, soft law standards and standards in industry that are being applied. So, for example, the ISO 2012-1 Sustainable Event Management Standard that's widely used for events like sports events, but also, as you'd be well aware, sort of cultural events and I don't know, expos and things like that. These standards now actually have been amended to include human rights elements. So I think that's one of the opportunities that we have, which is starting to say that, okay, human rights due diligence is required in these standards. That means that you have to identify the risks. And there is a real opportunity here for us to bring the climate part of that conversation into that discussion. It's very easy for us to say it's all about human rights, but no, we need to look at what the climate impact assessments are showing and then see, okay, where are those intersecting with people and human rights? And it's trying to always find that three-way intersection to both identify the challenges, but actually engage the people affected in in exploring solutions with them and really understanding their perspective and insights. So,
Thank you, Lucy. Okay, you mentioned broadcast there, and we're very lucky to have Suzanne Harding here from Sky. So just on this subject, maybe I'll start with David. What's the role of journalism and the broadcast industry in advancing this debate, do you think?
So I think the journalism and generally the broadcast industry can have two main contributions. Specifically, I mean, you mentioned litigation might be the last resort, but media scrutiny would be the first resort. We talked a lot about Qatar World Cup. There was a lot of scrutiny around workers' rights at the Qatar World Cup that was executed by journalists and in collaboration with Amnesty International and organisations like that. So there is that sort of holding to account, which basically is the fundamental basis of journalism and good journalism, or that's what I believe. I suppose many of my journalistic colleagues would be surprised to hear that there are as many as 9 sort of human rights. I think we focus on some pretty obvious ones like the right to life and maybe aforementioned workers' rights, but even the right to access information. I mean, we as media organisations are central to that. And so before, I'm freelance now, but previously I worked at BBC Sport, and I actually got BBC Sport to create a role which was as an editorial sustainability lead, not just a sustainability lead who could be confused for someone who has expertise in net zero and emissions reduction, which I don't have. But we saw a greater opportunity about talking to audiences, talking to a diverse range of audiences. Sport is the truly global, a global phenomenon. It's a global language. And actually you talk about the opportunities. The main opportunity is its popularity, its ability to bring people together, its ability to spread a positive message. So I was very proud that BBC were able to do a lot of that. But then also, I think the other thing that we can do is we can give a platform to athletes who want to speak up. And at the end of the day, people don't care about journalists. People don't care about, academics. People don't care about the UN or anything like that. They care about the sports stars and they care about the celebrities. So if we do have engaged sports stars, and sadly we don't have that many, then we can sort of push that message and give a platform for that message. And sport has a long history picking up on human rights. It's always been a part of it, a part of sport. From Muhammad Ali in the 1960s and the fights for civil rights, and Tommy Smith and rights for equality, and even now talking about issues like gender and the environment and things like that. I think the only other thing I was going to pick up on is we talked earlier about challenges as well. I think so. The opportunity is through sports popularity to talk to such a global community. That popularity brings people together, but that popularity is also presented, I think, 2 of its biggest challenges. One, it's attracted, the greenwashers and the sports washers. That popularity has also made it this huge global industry whereby it has become reliant on investment and money from organizations, governments, petrochemical industries that might not meet the criteria that we're talking about in this report. So that popularity is kind of a double-edged sword. And the final thing on that is that popularity and that business and that finance, and that is turned sport into this, behemoth of like public engagement. Those mega events we're talking about, there is an increasing feeling in the world of sport that it's very hard for a liberal democracy to stage these events. When the US, Canada and Mexico bid for the upcoming World Cup, there were many cities in those countries who just didn't want to be a part of it because they knew the expense and the cost that it would entail. And so there is a thought that increasingly, unfortunately, it is going to be totalitarian, authoritarian regimes that bid for these events, and that presents a huge challenge for sport. And again, it's something that comes from its popularity.
Thank you, Dave. Suzanne, would you like to Would you like to make any comments there from a Sky point of view?
Yeah, I certainly can. It's just hi everybody. Just to say, completely agree with everything that David has just said. I am definitely not an editorial specialist. I'm much more the kind of the operational side of things, but do work with all of our talented editorial teams. I work also with Charlotte, who is online with us today, who is our human rights lead for the whole of the Sky Group. So she has quite an enormous job. Mine is very much more based in Sky Sports, looking at two things: sort of how can we use our voice on screen? So talking so partly to what David's saying there, and also how can we kind of use the way we work and do good work as a basis for as good operations and good decisions going forward. I'm particularly interested. The report was fascinating, particularly interested as well because both myself and my colleague who look after this role for Sky Sports both come from a contracts background. So for about 5 or 6 years, we were both working on the kind of Sky Sports facilities contracts. So everything from the kind of the big trucks to the connectivity, all of the stuff that makes sort of covering sport telly work. We were working on that closely with procurement and the legal teams. So we've got quite a few examples of where we've used that kind of opportunity to know the suppliers, to know some of the other actors kind of in the ecosystem, to start understanding how are other people looking at the environment. Sky itself as a group has got quite a long history of talking and acting on sort of reducing environmental impact, but sort of then looking to our suppliers and saying, what do you do primarily to reduce emissions, but also what are you doing for your people? Our role also looks after anyone that is engaged with Sky Sports that works on our events. One of the sort of areas, very much a kind of practical example of having done something, is we started with a series of what we call responsible business questions a couple of years ago, and they've kind of grown and evolved over the last few years to kind of a comprehensive list of things that we ask, sort of expect from our suppliers in terms of environment action, and also in terms of people well-being and the kind of also that look to the future and the longevity of this industry. That's something that we're quite proud to say that has not only become targets that we reckon have with people, but that also it's become part of our scoring matrix. So if you want to continue working with and being a supplier to Sky, that the suppliers need to be approaching the way they do business from a people perspective and from an environment perspective. So it's an example of kind of bringing those things together. And I'm also pleased to say that they are incredibly on board and have done an awful lot of work over the last few years. We also very practically work with federations as well. So you're probably aware, I don't know if anyone has a subscription, but you're probably aware we don't do the mega sporting events. They need to be on terrestrial TV, which we're not. But we do cover the Premier League, the Formula One, kind of a lot of key areas. So what we're always doing is working with people, for people, to find ways to reduce emissions that kind of work for everybody, not just taking the responsibility from one section or one group of people and putting it on another, but kind of trying to consider everybody. And just a quick nod back to David for the editorial side of things. There's a great team of people that we work with that are, there's a number of examples over the last few years of where we've created documentaries on climate impact, very much putting the athletes at the heart of things. So it's the cricket climate crisis, and also more recently, football's toughest opponent. One of the other areas is, of course, we try to get involved in campaigning work, so campaigns through our editorial coverage, which obviously is a great way of bringing communities together to take action. There's there's other examples, but I'll leave it there for now.
That's great, Suzanne. Thank you very much. Yeah, we're kind of moving to the sort of.
Maybe Charlotte, sorry, maybe
Sorry.
Charlotte wants to add something.
Charlotte, would you have anything to add? If you can hear and if you can hear us and we can hear you,
Can you hear me okay?
we can.
We can see you
Hello.
too.
Lovely to be able to listen into this fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, and so I'm so heartened to know that this report is there and that you've been doing all this fantastic in-depth work. It's a conversation we were having with Lucy and Shubham certainly more than a year ago now, and we were able to have with some of the world of sports in the Sport Positive conference in the autumn, and an important conversation and something that Sky has obviously taken, as Suzanne said, a kind of a role in really embedding into the way we broadcast our sports, but as well as how we provide that platform and build it into our editorial, and also engage sports fans who we know will, a really kind of influential role in the world of climate action, and wanting to see that they can sort of take action within the way in which they engage in sport has been really great. So Suzanne's shared lots of fantastic examples, I think, across all of those. The only thing that I wanted to add and just reflect on from David's comments was I think we will start to see more, and because of the legal framework changing and some of these developments that some of the contributors have shared already, I think we will start to need to and I hope proactively share much more in our editorial. And I think we're already seeing many examples of sports being impacted by climate change, on a daily basis at the elite levels, as well as through grassroots and throughout. So whether we're talking about air pollution or people not being able to travel in different ways, I think we'll start to or extreme weather events impacting sports themselves, or people not being able to train in their home countries, and therefore reducing access to being able to get those good training opportunities and things, and the impact on health and livelihoods and well-being. I think we're increasingly starting to see our teams, our colleagues really wanting to understand much more deeply, and that's something the centre's really helped us with, is bringing those conversations more and more together from a human rights lens to the climate crisis and climate action. I think we'll see much more of that, but I think we need to keep telling these stories and keep sharing through these forums and more, where both where climate action is where climate change is really having an impact on people and the ability for people to play sports and be involved and get the most out of it, and as well as how within climate action there are really good ways of engaging people by doing good human rights due diligence, to make sure that climate action is really sustainable and is community led and owned. And I think we will, it's important for us as broadcasters to tell these stories more and more as firmly part of the sport story, which I think we're seeing happening. We have been really pleased to contribute to a new framework, which is in consultation at the moment, the Responsible Broadcasting Framework with the Centre, which provides a series of kind of guiding questions to consider just how across our kind of operations with our partners, and then editorially, we really take a human rights lens to our broadcast, and worked with many other broadcasters to do that and starting to use it. And we're really keen for feedback into that. So it's on the Centre's website, and anybody here who's got feedback on that, and particularly how we can build in this climate lens much more, I think will be really valuable, because we do need to make it really practical and tangible for there's such an array of sports. There's such a kind of huge kind of field, such a quickly changing world of sport, and with climate change as impacting it as well. We need these practical tools for our editorial teams and our operational teams and others to kind of keep this front and center, feel well informed and feel empowered to then include this in our storytelling in more and more meaningful ways.
That's brilliant, Charlotte. Thank you very much. Okay, it's really fascinating. Thanks, Suzanne and Charlotte. It's really fascinating to hear from specific broadcaster in how they're dealing with these issues. I think maybe if we could zoom out now to the role of business in general, and how can collaborations, partnerships work? And if I can ask Mike to speak on that one.
Oh, yeah, big question. Obviously, a huge question. And I'm going to be terribly academic about it, just because I've written so many notes. I've got a line of argument. So essentially, it sort of starts with Dave's point, which is about there's a huge question over whether large-scale events are actually good for us or not. And that there's a big existential question over large-scale events. And I think that this is the right time in the philosophy of big sports events, whereby they're trying to work out who they are and whether they're good enough for us or whether they're not going to be sort of incompatible with sustainable development. And that is a big question that's happening at the very top. And we're seeing that with new agendas that are going on. Did anyone see Rutger Bregman at Davos? Did anyone see Rutger Bregman? Yeah, how do you solve inequality? And he just says, look, you know, the answer is very, very bloody simple. Tax the rich, of which everyone just laughs and go, oh my God, that's such a stupid, simple solution. And actually, there's a very, very simple solution to everything that we're talking about, which is stop the proliferation of so many events that are forcing so many people to travel all around the world, because essentially there's a study about March Madness, which is one of the biggest sports events in the world, or conglomeration of sports events. 80% of the carbon emissions are from fan travel, which is just far out surpassing stadium operations and that sort of thing. And they've tried to combat it, but the things that they've used to combat it by regionalizing certain events have not worked whatsoever. I think that the question here is sort of Paris 2024 illustrated that if you build less, you then disrupt less people's lives through displacement, which we talked about in the report, but also you reduce the climate impact. So the fundamental question is ultimately that we've not really been looking at scope 1, 2, and 3 areas of environment, and looking at any sort of the supply chain impacts and that sort of thing. We've been taking an overly simplistic view of the environment, and that's caused us to essentially be where we are now. And I think that there's some very, very unpopular decisions that need to be made to build less, travel less, et cetera, et cetera. And whether that's virtual reality, XR, VR, helping to sort of overcome that is a question. So I believe that we need to channel our inner Bregman. Absolutely, in this sense. I've got a bit of a sort of a positioning statement before I get to the sort of nuts and bolts of the relationship. So ultimately, sports and events are environments and incubators whereby we have traditionally critiqued the world. You know, they're meant to be spaces whereby they're meant to represent something that is not out there in the real world, so to speak. And so they've always been brilliant at just sort of critiquing the way that the world works. And therefore, I've always served as a real good space for a sort of a northern star for policy making. And we've seen that with the sort of birth of the Stoke Mandeville Games, the Paralympics, the Paralympic Commission, the growth of that, and the symbiotic relationship that that's had with the UN Accords on accessibility, inclusivity, disability, and actually events are incredibly powerful for reorientating us broadly. And there are so many overlapping themes between the rights issues that were presented earlier, that there are some real quick wins that these large-scale sports events can have in order to justify their existence on this planet right now. And I think that they need to draw on a lot of the things that are in this report, and obviously what the centre is doing. The funny paradox is that if you actually speak to a lot of people at the upper echelon of sport governance, they don't really fully, in my view, understand the power of their platform or the sport whatsoever. More politician than anything, I would say. So what happens therefore is that if you have, and I'm not going to say who or what sport, but if you have a group of people that don't have a long-term stake in something, then how are you supposed to enact any sort of long-term change? So that needs to fundamentally change. And that is a real structural and very systemic problem that fundamentally exists. The The report serves as a marker for illustrating the distance yet to travel. And that is absolutely true for all these overlapping areas like the greenwashing, the sports washing, the social washing, all of it sort of all washes together in lots of different ways. My view is, and this links to the business side, because the business and sports and the organizations have to all sort of work in tandem, as we were sort of talking about earlier, is that I would fundamentally argue that there isn't even the right sort of what, you know, like, is anyone watching Simon Sinek on starting with why? Yeah, right. Start with why. Why are you doing it? And then the how and the what sort of follow. There's too much on the what, the how, and then why. And it's madness, really. It really is madness. So I would argue my gambit, and I would debate this to the hilt, and I would give you lots of examples if you want them. It is that we don't really have the right values and the North Star metrics that guide these things fundamentally. I think that there are absolutely on the surface, and there are a lot of well-meaning people, really well-meaning people actually at the upper echelons of governance of these things that really care. Like, I promise there's a lot of people that really, really care. The question is ultimately, do they know how to actually change the things that they want to change? And how deep are they willing to go to make that change happen? And I think that that's ultimately the problem. There's a lot of spectacle in sport, and I won't go into sort of detail around that. Therefore, I would say that without truly understanding the why, matters of how and what and where and when, it's sort of trivial in many ways, and events really do become quite or misaligned to the goals that they want to actually achieve. I would say that, and this is where University of Cambridge and all of us, I remember the University of Paris, I'm sort of flabbergasted, and I was always flabbergasted in all the interactions that I have with event owners, whereby they never use any sort of academic intelligence whatsoever. It's almost like we don't exist. It's genuinely like we don't exist in many ways. And there are some professors that manage to sort of get in there and enjoy that space, and that's good on them. But as a whole, they don't engage. And I would argue that many of the people that actually run the show operate within a sort of cocooned, bounded rationality of just, this is how we do it, this is how it's done, and the academic intelligence, emerging the two forms of intelligence, I think is going to be the way that we move forward. The lack of representation that was brought up around 1% of work in Africa, really interesting. You saw that replicates across essentially every single journal that's going, including the journal that I edit, Event Management. 95% of all the articles in Event Management Journal, which is our main journal for studying events and festivals, based in New York, is essentially from the UK, US. Some Australia, some New Zealand, 1%. I'd love 1%. Absolutely love 1%. So we need to fundamentally democratize knowledge and practice, and get that knowledge base and bring it into the mainstream. So one of the other problems I remember, I took this from Daniela Hurt at the Censor actually, which she presented a piece of academic work about the problem of many hands. And this is absolutely the problem, just for the record. Like, if you had to point to some problems, this is sort of one of the central problems, which is that the problem of many hands, which is the complex set of organizations and actors and governments and policymakers, etc., in that system. And anyone that's watched 2012, and we were talking about it earlier, anyone that's watched 2012 would realize that the sustainability lot think that they're doing legacy, and legacy think that they're doing sustainability, and it's all just they're all just sort of a little bit uncoordinated. Ultimately, the problem of many hands keeps palms clean because the buck simply moves around. So there's no sense of ownership, and I think that is a theme that's come through really well. So going on to the really specifically answering the question, after I've gone around it that way like an academic do, businesses, suppliers, sponsors, venues, they need to also be deeply aligned with the why, but we're saying that there's a sort of absence of why. And they need to be much more engaged with the universities and people that operate a more form of deeper intelligence, I would argue, in order to tackle the direct, indirect, and induced scope 1, 2, 3 climate impacts. At the moment, it's surface level. I would argue that ESG, economic social governance, environment social governance reports are actually a tool, a rhetorical device in which do not do the environment thing very well. In many ways, they're really good, but it depends on how they're enacted by some organizations. They are not fundamentally, they're not detailed enough. So therefore, that they act as more of a rhetorical device than something specific. So making sure that everyone's guided by that why and they have a metric system or rule base that constitutes success is really important, because people just play by the rules. We need to break the silos. That's come up quite a lot in terms of, oh, you're the music lot, you're the sports lot, you're the data lot, you're the business events lot, and we all need to work much closely together. And there is the sense in the events and festival world, which is the way that we're going to do something is essentially based on, oh, that worked last year, so why are we going to change that? And there is this fundamental intuition inside and lack of data inside events and festivals that really plays to the fact that it's a play space, it's a leisure space. And don't forget that. Like, it's one of the only spaces that has not been professionalized as much as home and work, the other two spaces in the world. You've got three spaces, like home, work, play. Don't make play boring. And that's sort of what we're in a way doing, making it more boring, but for the good. And that's really important, that we make it less fun, because in fun and frivolity is exploitation and problems emerge. There's a reason why they call it the third space, which essentially it's a space that things fall in the cracks. So that's what I probably suggest on that front. The people-centered work is really important. I don't know whether the people are at the center of the metrics and the focus. And so the people-centered approach, absolutely, we need to flip that. And I would say that there's a need for much more funding of local projects and climate science in the destinations that they land in as well. So there's a way in which you redistribute the money back into the local economy, as well as more broadly climate science. But that's me rambling, but it gives you a background and where I come from, and some of the systemic problems that we face.
Mike, that was fascinating. Thank you very much.
Can I just pick up on
please do.
I think it's so. I was a sport journalist 15 years before I, 10 years before I even did anything on the environment sustainability. I'm perhaps a little bit more cynical about you, but I think there are two whys, and there are two whys which dominate the sporting landscape. And the first is making money, and then that permeates down to survival. And I'm a great believer in the fact that football, as the dominant sport in the world, sets the agenda for sport and sets the tempo and sets the pace. And as sport has got greedier and greedier and bigger and ever more football matches and bigger tournaments, it forces every other sport to get greedier, to get bigger, to get, and so as you go down on the list of global sports and successful sports after football, and it's a long way down to some of them, the secondary ones, yeah, they're obsessed with money, but you soon get into those sports that are just obsessed with survival or focusing on survival. The why is survival. And what do you need to survive? Well, you need money. And so I think, sadly, money is the why. And you talk about the people at the top of these organizations who are committed to the bigger, broader picture. I don't think there's many of them. But that's a bit of a cynical take, but yeah.
There's 10%. I would, in my mind, I've done the Pareto, maybe 20% that are just entirely crowded out by what is essentially, it's essentially money. And then you've got some people like Julie Duffus, for example, of whom is amazing and interesting and has such a big heart. And there's many people.
These people who are engaged in sustainability, they have such little access to, and the people who are explaining, it's not just environmental sustainability, it's social sustainability. They have so much so little access to the very highest levels. I did an interview with the executive director of sustainability for UEFA. He's the man in charge. He's got a team of 18, and ultimately he says, "I'm powerless." He says, "I'm powerless. I can't do anything. So what's the point?" And when you do push into it, they have a three-pillared approach to sustainability. They have social, environmental, and economic. And when you push them on it and push them on it and push them on it, ultimately economic sustainability is the most important thing to them, because they're in competition with FIFA. They see themselves in competition with FIFA, who see themselves in competition with the Premier League, and they've started a Club World Cup, and the whole thing just kind of like is an arms race. And as I say, everything permeates down the sporting pyramid from that.
I would say if anyone's watched, and we were talking earlier about Adam Curtis's documentaries on the BBC, Can't Get You Out of My Head, and the most recent one, Shifty. You ever watched it? It's amazing. So essentially, ultimately argues that every resistance movement fails, every single one, because they essentially misunderstand where the power is. And it is the funny thing is the solution to a lot of this is not in the practical actions. We know really what to do. In many ways, we know what to do. There's some interesting climate innovations. I don't know whether anyone watched the BBC documentary about all the amazing innovations that sort of, putting more cloud cover. And it's amazing, right? It's amazing stuff, right? But fundamentally, in order to permeate through what my best mate calls calls it something worse than this, but treacle. There's like a layer of treacle. You've got people really well-meaning, but the layer of treacle that means that ideas just fundamentally don't permeate up and make an actual change. And it really is, and it sounds incredibly boring, but it's about what are the levers of actual power and change that you can actually create. Because there's no point talking about all the wishy-washy practical stuff, because no one's going to listen. It fundamentally has to be accepted by the people with power. And I'm not trying to intentionally be Marxist at all. It's just reality.
What are the levers?
And I'm telling you, not that I probably even know. Yeah.
All right, thanks both of you. I should probably declare an interest here that I worked inside a sports governing body for 10 years. I may be the only person in the room who has done. So I'm fascinated by the fact that you think there's an existential question of why, and I agree with you. Just a couple of small things to think about is that internally they're on a treadmill. They're on a treadmill of events, and that kind of drives things naturally. Coupled with that is commercial deals in marketing and TV that are quite long term, some of them. And that also leads to a lack of agility. So here we need to move, we need to break things and move quickly. And there isn't that necessarily level of interest in doing that, coupled with the systemic problem that money is going from the governing bodies down to national governing bodies who are voting for people in the governing bodies. And that is I would say the central problem, having worked in there. But anyway, the answer, it appears, people-centered approach. So back to Cambridge, perhaps, with how does the human rights and people-centered lens add value to all these issues and solving these problems?
I don't know if you want to comment that, but I think there isn't, from what I'm gathering also from this discussion, but overall in any issue, that there's really just one way to champion change. And I'm sure many of us can think of different ways that could be taken, different steps. I'm sure every single person in the room has a different answer of where best to start and what to do. And maybe part of the answer is also that there have to be different, like there has to be different approaches. There's maybe us more from from the law side, we're looking at the legal aspects of it or how to hold accountability through law. Then there's the journalist way of how to hold accountability through raising awareness. And I think, I think there's a lot that can be done also through sort of empowering. And I think that's a lot what you do at the center in terms of empowering communities and athletes through educating people. And educating on this sort of three-way intersection that hopefully now we're also doing through this discussion. And I think also through this discussion, breaking some of the silos that exist within profession within different professions, well, within law also have the lawyers only talking among themselves, and then there's different sections of law that breaks it down further. But we're looking at within different industries or within the sports ecosystem that there's even more silos. So I think mixing like science and law and lived reality in sports and athletes is quite a challenge, but I think a really important way of looking at how do we put people at the heart of it. And I thought one of the points that was made earlier around the fact that, I mean, at the end of the day, people care about stories, about the people that they look up to, about the heroes that they have, whether that's in sports or in another field that they're passionate about. And I think there's a lot that can be done in putting people at the heart of the conversation. The same goes also for the climate crisis. We can look at numbers of, flooding has caused this much damage and this causes so much economic harm, or so many lives are lost. But if we only look at numbers, we forget that behind it, there's stories, there's people, there's lives. And I think that is a really strong aspect that shouldn't be forgotten, to use that and to also clarify what the obligations and duties are. Turning back a little bit to the legal perspective, what are the tools that are available in, for example, even soft guidelines like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Climate litigation is on the rise. We've already heard that in earlier discussions today. Now also, I think one of the ones that I should also mention that we hadn't mentioned today yet is maybe the Luyana versus RWE case, which took place in Germany earlier this year, highlighting how corporate actors even can be held accountable to their emissions, even in a different and transboundary aspects of on a different part of the world. A case about Peru taking a Peruvian farmer taking a Germany energy company to court. And I think there's important lessons that can be drawn out of how accountability is taken forward. And law, I guess, is a little bit of the strong arm, the twisting that has to take place in terms of not the nice, it would be good if, save the planet and save the people, but showing that there are obligations. And we have to hold actors accountable, states and non-state actors, especially when it comes to vulnerable, marginalized communities, which, if we break it down, that's also within the sports sector, the most risk, the communities most at risk of not being able to have their rights recognized, but also most at risk in terms of displacement, in terms of hunger, in terms of the economic consequences of climate change. And I think, yes, maybe litigation is the last resort, but I do think this will also come into the sporting industry. And I think the sports sector has a unique opportunity to champion action and to leverage its enormous soft power for the future of humanity, of our rights as present, but also of those of future generations.
Okay, thank you, Leah. I mean, I think that we recognise that sport has an enormous soft power, and I think sport talks about its soft power a lot as well, and how important it is and what a force for good it is. Turning to Lucy, I mean, how can we get sport to lead by example and champion a human rights approach here? And how can we engage all actors in the sport ecosystem to have a collective positive?
So I think we've got different perspectives here. We've got the journalist and broadcaster perspective. We've got the point around, it's all money. That's the bad power that talks. But we've got, both of you did to an extent. We've got the point about the legal perspective, and that thing. And I think ultimately there are many touch points. I think Leah, you mentioned it. There are many different touch points, and no one of those is necessarily going to be the silver bullet that solves the problem. I think you talked about the research side of things, and I do think that's crucial. I think we have, with this report, it's a start. We've started to map what those rights are. I think one of our next steps is going to be to try and unpack that and make it more practical. So what does that actually mean for sports bodies? How do those that are interested and engaged, unpack it? What does it mean for their individual sport? Who are the people that are going to be impacted? the events, how are they going to be impacted, and also what are the knock-on effects of those events on local people's environmental protections. And then obviously there's this point around we are, as you absolutely say, it's the conversation. Yes, we're talking in English, but even so, it's so dominated by European and North American actors, and we really need to widen the scope. But I think even if we take the very cynical view that it's all about money and money is all that speaks and that's the only way, and survival, I think survival is key, because actually these events will cease to happen if something is not done about it. We are already seeing what that looks like in terms of the sports calendar being decimated. We already know that the Winter Olympics are on a life support system, and ultimately, possibly that money talking will, I mean, in an optimistic world, that money speaking will have positive effects. But it is, I think the role of athletes, and I think the role of actual affected people and the stories that they're telling and the narratives that they're telling will play a fundamental role in this conversation. And I think those are we need to somehow harness all of those different things, but in a somehow sane way that keeps the trajectory forward and stops us losing hope. I think that's one of the things. So often we lose hope and we fail to talk to each other. We fail to break out of our silos, whether that's a human rights silo, a legal silo, a climate silo, journalistic silo. We really keep to talking.
That's brilliant. All right, thanks for everyone's input from the panel. Hopefully that stimulated some thoughts from the audience. I'd like to have a little Q&A session if anyone has a question. Oh, we've got a couple actually. Okay. Gentleman in the middle then.
I want to pose a general question, but I want to illustrate it with a specific example. The general question is, do you see in the future, with the increased layer that you referred to in climate crisis litigation based upon human rights in the sporting area, particularly to enjoin, by way of injunction, for example, particular sporting events, and I'll illustrate it with the particular Formula One, and drawing together hopefully a few themes that have been referred to. Lucy referred to the fact that the rights holders are beyond the athletes themselves and indeed the community. And David highlighted the fact that there are many communities who don't want these events, more and more so. Pardon me. Participation was referred to in relation to the identification of the particular human right to education. Here you have, and I think also Mike mentioned the fact that emissions, simply in terms of transport of fans, account for 80%. But here you have what is still called a sport, and it was listed by Suzanne amongst the sports that Sky cover, something that is a sport, which in terms of participation is absolutely minimal in terms of the actual participants. In terms of participation, even in terms of spectators, absolutely minimal, and largely by people who are attending by way of flying around the world, often in private jets. In terms of participation economically, it doesn't even get to the point where you've got a national body where funds trickle down to other lower bodies or ahead. The profits are concentrated in the hands of very, very few. Participation in terms of even viewing is very limited, with great respect to Suzanne and to Charlotte, simply to those who can afford to financially or morally support Mr. Murdoch's channels. So it is extremely limited in that regard. Yet at its very heart is the burning of fossil fuels. And even in a circumstance where even a lot of the raison d'etre for that in the past, that is the development of better combustion engines, is no longer a thing. So do we face the situation where simply on human rights, climate crisis, and risk-reward economic grounds, we will see people try to enjoin particular events because, for example, they have a knock-on effect to things like the climate and endangering other sporting events, as you've identified, Lucy, like the Olympics? I'm happy for anyone to...
Sorry, what's the question? So
do you see a time where people will be going to court to simply get an injunction against particular events or particular sports because of human rights, climate crisis and related issues, simply being that it is not in the national interest to hold particular events?
It's already currently going on, for example, on participation and access to environmental information as the Aarhus Convention, which has a committee which monitors compliance by it. And there's currently a collective in France who has filed a complaint in front of that committee against the choice of the French Alps for the future winter Olympic Games there. So that is currently ongoing. That is something we develop further in the report. So I would say, yes, there are currently developments going on there.
Well, I think we will see more cases that will come forward on this interaction, just because, yeah, I mean, there's the obvious sports that are just on the live thread, like the winter sports, where there's a long time already. Personal story quickly, but my godfather's a really great skier, and even many years back, they had a lot of discussion around what is the what is the impact of the Olympics and the skiing Olympics in the Alps. So this has been an ongoing conversation for many years. So it's not necessarily something new, and I think we are going to see more of it. And I think it just really depends how the developments globally happen, whether that would lead. I don't know. It's hard to say whether that would lead to like a sporting event being banned or whatever. I think that's probably more the extreme that would probably it could only happen if we are in a societal situation. We're having a big climate breakdown already. There's a breakdown of people not being able to go to events or these not taking place. But there's certainly going to be challenges around where events will take place and in what with what sort of obligations exist in order to ensure that duties are met, whether that's climate, human rights ones. So yeah, I think it will be an interesting space to watch in terms of how law and legal processes will respond to the challenges that are brought forward by citizens. Oftentimes, concerned citizens or groups that are like, this is affecting us and our livelihoods in this town or in this area, and the impacts of climate change, the impacts of big sporting events. So I think it will be a big challenge to rise up to that. And I think it's up to the sporting sector to look at the risks that are there with climate change and be like, well, how do we then respond to that and make it more, address the challenge, use the positive effects of the sports that have, that can champion that, especially if we also look at sports within the sector of the right to movement and the right of people for like education and children, of course, as well. So, no, I completely hear you. I think it's a really good.
I'm just conscious of time. Are we okay to carry on for another quarter of an hour or so, 10 minutes? Would that be okay? Or I don't know whether anyone's coming in the room or anything like that.
No, it's fine with the room.
Okay, fine. Could I just come to Mike then on that one?
I get you. I'm with you. Before I respond, can I ask a question? And if you could bullet point, what are the grounds by which you would not have that event? Just bullet point the rationale as to why that might be litigated or scrapped. Just so I completely get you.
It'd be brought on the basis of the things that Leah has identified before in terms of impacts upon human rights, and we are seeing those sorts of cases.
From Formula One, is this?
So in terms of the effect of the sport upon climate, as I say, it just burns fossil fuels and flies people around the world with huge teams doing so as well. So that there is this impact upon the climate, which is real, identifiable, and simply is based on emissions, that the contribution of that to the greater good as compared to its impact upon the various list of human rights that have been identified, that simply on human rights grounds, the impact upon that is such that that's an event which should be enjoined by way of an injunction and should not be permitted to be held because it's unjustifiable.
Yeah, and I'm with you.
Well, it should sound
Let me respond.
justifiable because that's not to put in a legal framework. It is impacts on human rights in an illegal manner such that it should be enjoined. That is the legal framework.
So I would say, isn't there a different way of running the event that reduces the impact and therefore gives it enough legitimization? So let me give you an example. So 400, how many people go to Silverstone? Let's just say 400 plus thousand. Is it 400,000 plus?
200.
Like millions watch it online, etc., etc. And I would argue that without an event of that magnitude, the unintended consequence socially, culturally, on people's sort of mental well-being, their enjoyment, I would say that there is an argument to be had to justify it on the grounds of non-environment.
I'm not saying there's an argument to be had. I'm saying whether or not it can be envisaged that the case would be brought, not that it'll be won.
Okay.
What about, sorry to jump in.
Suzanne, please do.
Is there a need almost? But I think the kind of the areas that we work in and the way we're working with federations is that's the idea that it's always great to have a legal framework behind things that underpins things, but that we don't need to get there, because one of the things we're incredibly aware of at Sky and all broadcasters is like the court of public opinion, and the fact that there are all such a high percentage of viewers now, particularly the younger generations, for people saying we expect environment and we expect people to be considered in sports and the future of sports. We do work with Formula One who are actually, you're right, it's an enormous emitter as a sport, but they are working on a lot of initiatives to firstly reduce down the fuel, put it onto a completely renewable fuel. At the moment, that's just Formula 2 and 3, but the idea is that it will be Formula 1 as well. They're also looking at the way that they freight things around the world as well, and also looking at how they can kind of better change the calendar. So I think what I'm hoping is it's almost like it's great to have the legal framework there, to hold people accountable to, but actually public opinion is pushing people in that direction anyway. People know that, it's back to the survival point, there is a level of, now it's almost like, although there's money in Formula One, it's becoming less popular to be an emitting sport. So I think
that'll have a knock-on effect as people prepared to put their sponsorship behind it and things of that kind as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I think whatever Formula One does, it has a fundamental problem that it is a poster boy for the combustion engine, has been for many years, and there are huge question marks over its claim to have 100% sustainable fuel if it ever gets there. I also think that the debate around, no doubt there will be litigation. The litigation will come from protest groups and from campaigners. There has been an example of litigation in the Netherlands before the Dutch Grand Prix. The circuit was built close to a wildlife area, and there was a wildlife pressure group who sought to try and get an injunction to prevent the Grand Prix from going ahead. Simultaneously, back in the days of the Arab Spring, the Grand Prix, the first ever Bahrain Grand Prix, became a focus of huge protests in that country. They didn't manage to get, and obviously they would never get access to the courts or to a regime, but like it's definitely going to happen, because these organizations will use whatever mechanisms and means they can to highlight their agenda. But there are fundamental problems with all sport. I don't think Formula One are the worst, but I do think that there are fundamental problems in no matter what they say they're doing for the good, effectively they are basically promoting motorsport, and that across the globe is a really good thing for car companies, for the petrol companies, and that sustainable fuel, by the way, even if it is 100% sustainable for Formula One, never going to end up in your car, never. It's just not scalable. So I think that there are huge, and this is why I think this is where journalism comes into it, because all of these need to be dug into, all of these issues need to be highlighted and talked about, because you can't just take whichever sport it is says about it at face value. It's never going to work like that.
I think it's a really interesting discussion and a really good microcosm of the kind of three areas of the report, really. How climate change is affecting sport, how sport is affecting climate change, and then how sport can be a platform. That is sort of encompassed in the discussion we've just had there. Any other questions before we finish? There's one at the back, by the look of it.
Well, there's two because I've been manning the chat for everyone online.
Marvellous.
So the first one, Ramel asks if someone could give a bit more clarity about where disability might fit into this conversation. There's been a mention of marginalised groups and facing greater health risks, which could link to disability, and so wondered if anyone could extend their as in linking, so where this is there particular, I assume what they mean is there, does anyone know of any particular ways that the sporting system is trying to, I don't know, encourage those with disability, or looking at that from the human rights point of view from within sport, encouraging accessibility and also being more aware of the impact that sport can have, climate change, creating more health risks, etc.
I can add something anecdotally to that, just in the fact that the IPC has one of the, my opinion, has one of the least ambitious sustainability agendas going, and has actually been removed from the UN Sport for Climate Action for not meeting it. But like, and there was a consideration of doing a story on that, but they face financial challenges and sponsorship challenges, and arguably event hosting challenges that the IOC and the Olympics and the World Cup don't face. So they've got more real battles to fight, more urgent battles to fight. And I do think that there should be greater collaboration between sports and sports organisations and governing bodies. And especially that's just one example where it's disability sport against, able-bodied sport, but even about from sort of like international level governing bodies to sort of national level governing bodies, and from global north to global south, not just within sports, but cross sports. And that is something that I know some organizations are trying to, you're talking about the sort of like the many hands, like just trying to sort of bridge those gaps, but it's not enough.
Lucy, would you like to comment?
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think your point about survival is crucial there, because some of those sports bodies are very, very small. I mean, we've interacted with them. Some of them have got, you think they're huge organizations, and it's smoke and mirrors, because actually when you interact with them, they've probably got a team of about 5 people, or if that. Some of them are even smaller than that. And therefore it is obviously beholden on those that are the big players, ideally, to be trying to cascade that through their networks of sports federations. But I also think that what's the point I was going to make? Yeah, I think we've got this issue. Formula One is obvious a case in point where it's kind of a clear-cut situation, but we still, all sports have these issues and these challenges, and it is going to be beholden on each sport, but particularly those that have the greater resources to follow some of the practice that we're looking at. But it is going to take hard decisions. It's going to take some of those decisions that you've particularly been raising around some of the existential challenges as to what this means. And I know in the report, particularly coming back to the disability question, the report does unpack what some of the climate change situations, whether that's extreme heat or air pollution, the additional effect that has on disabled athletes, and including child athletes as well. And it's how do we start to, harness some of the voices of people, but potentially some of the athletes and the journalists, and what role they have to play in this as well. So
maybe some of the researchers also want to add something, or
yes, one of the examples I came across in my research on the right to life, specifically for heat-related exertional heat strokes, was the cooling techniques that are used, or that are most effective when somebody suffers from exertional heat stroke that could be fatal, is full water submersion or something like that. And that is often not possible if, for example,
you're facing disability where you can't walk. So I think what is most important is that experience need to be talked about so that systems can be adapted, so that people with disabilities don't face these barriers. But if we don't talk about the experiences, then the systems are made for people without disabilities. And then, yeah, that's an issue. But that would be a very specific example, but there are loads.
And maybe also from the right to education and physical activity as part of education, if someone has special needs, it will be way harder to allow them to experience sport in a comparable way to someone who does not have these special needs, especially in a country with already limited resources. So it's unlikely that there will be specialized equipment, or if the family has to relocate, they will lose access to what they had in their home region, and they might not be able to afford to get that again in the space where they had to relocate. And similar with access to information, as I mentioned before, and as it was mentioned by other people today already, there is lack of intersectionality in the research community, and we all know that there are some health conditions that are researched way more. For example, male pattern baldness is extremely well researched condition compared to conditions that affect women or disabled people, of whom there might be even smaller amount, and even less of them will be represented as researchers. So I think these are some of the ways.
Okay, thank you very much. So before we wrap up then, is there anybody on the panel got anything burning to finish with before we wrap up?
I was going to say one thing that I meant to say in relation to Formula One, burning.
Yeah,
yeah,
it's appropriate.
Rather than the pun. That when at the BBC, we were very mindful of the fact that we were serving our licence fee payers, and large numbers of those licence fee payers are huge sports fans. But there's arguably just as many who aren't sports fans. And so when we had this conversation, we had to serve the interests of not just sports fans, of the non-sports fans. And I think that there is a danger. I think that this conversation just happens within sport in isolation. I think bringing in all aspects, and I think this is one of the good things when you talk about business and partnerships and events and hosting, and then it starts to include communities and people who don't understand sport and don't like sport. But I think we have to realize that, yes, sport has an obligation to those people who aren't fans as well. It has an obligation to the environment that it basically relies on. You can't play sport, we haven't talked about, dirty water, which is actually an impact of climate change from torrential rain, flooding sewage systems. You can't swim in dirty rivers, oceans. You can't, run in polluted air. It's the environment is integral, and the preservation of that environment is a way of speaking to people outside of sport. And I think that's important to bring them in, and maybe they can be a more effective way of holding sport to account.
Okay, that's a perfect way to end then. All right, I'd like to thank Tonya and Leah and David, Mike and Lucy on the panel, and very much thank you all, and all the research team, of course, as well, and thank you all for coming. There is now a networking drink and cheese straws as well outside. So please, just to the left, you'll find that, and we'll come out. And if you'd like to discuss anything with the panel further, I'm sure they'll be delighted to. So thank you very much. And the report also will be online on the Centre's website, and I think the Cambridge website as well. So or if you can read quickly, you can have a look at it. Pretty good stuff.
Keep reading.
Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you.